Box to Rose countdown to 20 and a listen back to our conversation with Pro Football Hall of Famer Darrell Green. As far as an HBCU National Game of the Week, it's really hard to determine for week 2 what a game of the week would be. There were so many really good football games last week. We mentioned the Florida A&M South Carolina State game. We previewed the North Carolina Central Alabama State game. There were so many. Instead of picking a game, let's kind of look at this schedule in week 2 at some of the more prominent games. This is more, I would say, week 2 is more of a rivalry, the rivalry kind of matchups in some of these in-state games. And I think what the cool thing really is when you're an HBCU at the FCS level, you play up and you get hundreds of, generally, when you play up an FBS opponent, depending upon the opponent, you get hundreds of thousands of dollars in guaranteed money to play these football games in most respects. And I think the cool thing in what we're going to see this weekend is to turn that back around and pay a Division II HBCU to come play you. And I think that's really cool. So then the Division II school, and it's really, you're only giving that school about 10% of what you would get in terms of an FCS HBCU playing up. So you've got some great in-state rivalries, right? Miles and Alabama State play. Remember, this was a game that Miles defeated Alabama State on last year. Miles is coming off a really a good game, couldn't close West Alabama out, who's one of the more prominent members in terms of Division II football, had them lost on a 20-yard field goal by 1 point. And Alabama State coming off that tough loss to North Carolina Central with no Andrew Body in this football game. Even though I wouldn't consider this one of the more prominent games, I mean, it's cool to see Alabama A&M hosting Kentucky State. You know, an intriguing game is Rice hosting Texas Southern. Now, I'm not sure how good Rice is. I know Texas Southern had a really nice win last week against Prairie View A&M, and so you've got that game in Houston. That should be a game that should have a pretty good amount of fans in the stands. Another game maybe not as prominent, but still you're talking about a Jackson State hosting a Lane, right? You're talking another game that's not as prominent, not a rivalry, but Southern is hosting Savannah State. Looking at the schedule, Grambling State is hosting Tuskegee, right? You've got some of these games. Let's look at some of the other games as I look at the schedule. A&T is hosting Winston-Salem State. Now, this is a game that is being played for the first time in 14 years. Going back in the day, it used to be a rivalry, and then the MEAC, like in the early part of the 2000s, discouraged these type of games from being played because the MEAC wanted to be seen more as a prominent FCS or 1AA conference at that time. And really, at that time, A&T had 2 Division II teams or schools. It played North Carolina Central in the Aggie Eagle Classic, and then also played Winston-Salem State. So that game sort of went away in terms of it being a game every year that A&T hosted. And then it was kind of on and off. Remember, the Winston-Salem State Rams were in the MEAC, or were to be members of the MEAC, and then that fell through. And so this game was no longer really scheduled. Let's take a look at the schedule at some of the other games. Norfolk State and Virginia State. Now, that would have been the HBCU National Game of the Week I would have looked at. Norfolk State 0-2, coming off the big loss to East Carolina. However, it's a Norfolk State team that forced East Carolina into 6 turnovers last week. And remember, took Florida A&M to the brink 2 weeks ago before falling to the Rattlers. And it's a Virginia State team that's coming off, a really big win in that Black College Football Hall of Fame Classic up in Canton, Ohio. So that should be a really good game. An in-state rivalry, an old CIAA rivalry. Another old CIAA rivalry in-state. Hampton hosting Virginia Union. Going back a couple of years ago, I believe Virginia Union defeated Hampton. I had a chance to see Hampton play. Look, Jada Byers is one of the best running backs in the country, including all divisions. He had in excess of 200 yards last week. And Hampton gave up a lot, with about 180 yards or so rushing to Morgan State last week. That's going to be a tough day for Hampton in terms of trying to stop Jada Byers. Looking at some of the other more prominent games, I mean, Fayetteville State's got a game against UNC Pembroke. The two schools are separated by about 40 minutes or so. That should be awesome. So you've got some games. The Citadel, South Carolina State is at the Citadel. So there are some games. There's really no game that jumps out to me. North Carolina Central is hosting Elon. Another in-state battle. I wouldn't call it a rivalry, but an in-state battle. Townsend and Morgan State, that's a rivalry type of game, although Townsend has dominated that series. But Morgan played an exceptional game on last year against Townsend. That game is going to be at Townsend. So you've got some, Florida Memorial and Edward Waters, right? Jacksonville, where Edward Waters is. Florida Memorial is in Miami. So you've got a couple of games, and you've got a conference game. Clark Atlanta is hosting Allen. Big time win by Clark Atlanta last week over Fort Valley State, where David Wright, the quarterback, he transferred from Allen to Clark Atlanta. Now he's facing his old team. If anything, that's the game of the week. I think if you look at the schedule, that would be the game of the week. I don't know what to make of Allen. New coaching staff, I'm sure a new roster, and hadn't played a game to this point. Meanwhile, David Wright, 7 touchdowns to 0 interceptions, threw for 423 yards last week in the victory over Fort Valley State. An interesting game. Tennessee State is at North Dakota State. So you've got some games. More now that I look at the schedule a little bit more, that I would say, if anything, that Clark Atlanta and Allen game would constitute the HBCU National Game of the Week for a couple of reasons. Again, Teddy Keaton leaves Allen to go to Clark. Big win for Clark last week over Fort Valley State. And now you've got the situation where Allen comes to Clark, where Teddy Keaton is the coach, where David Wright is the quarterback. And so I think that is really your HBCU National Game of the Week. Don't really know what to make of Allen coming into this season. I know that Clark Atlanta's got David Wright. You've got David Wright. You're doing something right there. So with that, the HBCU scoreboard can be found on the boxtorow.com website, and it has all of the games listed for Saturday, all of the results from Thursday. Again, log on to our website, boxtorow.com. On the weekend edition of Box to Row, you're going to hear from Emmanuel Wilson, the former running back at Johnson C. Smith and Fort Valley State, now the running back with the Green Bay Packers. Also, Clark Lee, the head football coach at Vanderbilt, going to join us on the program. Vanderbilt with a big win, really big win over Virginia Tech. It's going to host Alcorn State on Saturday.